Hi, my name is Brittany Logan, and I'm the president of Young Americans for Liberty here at UCA. And this is Jared LaRoe, who's the president of UCA Young Democrats. We organized the debate here today, to discuss some issues. And I'll let Jared kind of explain how the debate came to be, actually.
Like she said, I'm Jared, and this is my partner, Seth, in the debate. He is the vice president of the College Democrats of Arkansas and also a member of the UCA Young Democrats. And we came up with we had the idea of the debate with Young Americans for Liberty because we had a debate last semester with the College Republicans. And so Young Americans for Liberty approached us with the idea of having a debate. And we were so busy this year that we weren't really able to, focus on doing that. And then, we realized at the end of the semester, we should definitely have it. And so, that's kind of how it started. We met up at Starbucks, discussed what issues we'd be talking about, set up the guidelines, the different rules for the debate. And so, that's how it started, just kind of within a week ago.
All right, and then the debate, the format of the debate is going to be pretty simple. Each group is going to talk about 3 topics, and each group will have 10 minutes to discuss each of those topics. After each group uses their 10 minutes, there will be 5-minute rebuttals for each, and then we're going to close it out with closing statements from each group. So I'm going to pass it on to Steve here. He's going to be our awesome moderator and read our questions.
All right, we've got 10 minutes. The first question, should the government protect domestic jobs and producers from foreign competition? Young Democrats first.
All right, the issues pertaining to free trade versus protectionism is not an easy one. The ability for American companies to freely trade with foreign nations is a prudent part of our market economy. And one of the greatest benefits of free trade is that through business transactions, we fuel the economies of other countries that would possibly be receiving aid from the United States in other ways. And the stimulation of these foreign economies is prudent to their plight for becoming a developed nation. And the benefit of having more and more developed nations in our world is an obvious one. Another benefit from free trade can be the freedom for businesses to trade more frequently and have a higher exchange rate for goods. But we believe that complete free trade is overall not good for America. And yes, there are many problems with total protectionism as well. And I will highlight on those issues soon. But I believe that we must find a common ground between protecting American jobs and the environment, avoiding slave labor and exploitative labor, while allowing private companies to trade with foreign nations without such high tariffs on imported goods. The stances of the UCA Young Democrats will not polarize either free trade or protectionism as completely right or wrong, and so this is where we stand. What we can see in the United States is that through a system of tough protectionist regulations, the desired promotion for industries over the future has not been fulfilled. Through these protectionist politics, we see very little competition between industries and a larger burden on the consumer. This ultimately harms the U.S. economy, and while other countries are benefiting from free trade, America remains on the back burner. Through a loss of competition and a weak industry, the innovative technologies and products in the United States cannot compare to the innovations of technologies and products like those of free trade nations. So through extreme protectionism, we effectively lose jobs due to the weakened competition within our borders, and it damages our economies of scale when other nations are trading with their home as well as abroad, and we are not. But if we are to establish complete fair trade laws in America, the negative effects we see with protectionism arise as well. Free trade forces American workers to compete with other labor forces that have large differences in their wages. Through this competition, American jobs are lost due to extremely profitable outsourcing. Another negative effect from not having rules and regulations on the way businesses trade with other countries is extreme environmental damages. Now, I'm not quoting Al Gore or preaching a sermon declaring that we must all stop driving cars. I drive a 2002 Isuzu Rodeo, for Christ's sake, so I'm not, a tree hugger on this. But while some private companies have found phenomenal consumer consumption of their products by going green, environmental regulations on trade and businesses must exist in order to retain our ecological foundation. When we look at NAFTA and see the specific harms that were caused by a concentration of industry on the Maquiladora zone, we can see how without some regulation, the environmental impacts are devastating. This ultimately causes a race to the bottom. Now, while private industry can make rational decisions that do not specifically harm the environment, we can see empirically through the use of free trade ecological destruction of certain landscapes. A business's top priority is to maximize profits. This is not wrong. This is what capitalism is. But without a top priority focusing on the environment, the ecological damage that will be done ultimately destroys the future capabilities of business. Without resources or stabilization within certain lands, the potential for production and trade ultimately decrease. This is exactly the opposite of what businesses want. So we believe that the government should regulate trade to fit our environmental needs. And while my opponents will probably argue that private companies will fix themselves, curb their production to satisfy the environment, we must still have regulations in place for those very many companies that will disregard the environment. Moving on from the environment, we now come to the issue of exploitative labor. The Young Democrats believe that while the rights of citizens to have private property and to strive for economic prosperity is necessary in a free society, we cannot allow that when it directly harms the rights of others and exploits their labor and inhibits their welfare. Even while we cannot check for the unfair labor laws in undeveloped nations, we can check for the way that we conduct business with them. Being a conscious consumer isn't enough anymore. We know what GMOs are. We know that Nestle is infamous for its use of child slave labor. We know that Nike exploits the impoverished, yet we still buy from them. We believe that the government must require that companies do not exploit other workers. And now using workers that have lower wages than an American is not necessarily exploitation. That is not what we are arguing. So the use of children in dangerous positions using coercive tactics, establishing harsh working conditions must be checked for. I wish that private companies would adopt fair trade agreements, and while some do, others will still choose not to. But through my articulation that protectionism is needed on some degree, I believe that we cannot polarize either side. The U.S. government shouldn't protect every single industry, but the market alone won't promote innovation and competition on the scale in which we need. Instead of establishing extremely high tariffs, the government should provide better incentives to motivate innovation and technology within our border. Have larger tax credits for companies that follow the guidelines and work within our border. Give grants to the private companies that provide great business. Pure free trade is not what we need, and total protectionism is not either. But instead of totally punishing private companies, let's reward them for bringing Americans more jobs and fueling our economy. We have to find middle ground on this issue. It is easy to read political theory and hypothetical economic situations and come to extreme conclusions and stances. I could read a Keynes article or a Marx article and spout about how the means of production must be owned by the state, and then only then will we stop all forms of exploitative labor. I could also quote Adam Smith and declare that the invisible hand as well as profit incentives will solve for the unethical issues that arise through labor, but we cannot do that. We are here to deliberate on issues and strive to come to the best policies through discourse and education. We must use empirical evidence when evaluating these issues. And I believe that this is exactly what I have done. A polarization of either side is ultimately dubious in my mind. And lastly, I believe that the ultimate distinction between the Young Americans for Liberty and the Young Democrats is our hierarchy of rights. It does not mean that either of us value some rights over others, because I think we can all agree that all our rights as independent beings all matter greatly and equally. But the ultimate distinction is with the full faith in free markets and trade. While my opponents believe that unless one is allowed to have complete freedom over their economic developments, all other rights and issues will be subjected as well. That through total economic freedom, our liberties will be truly felt. And what the Young Democrats believe is that currently there are systems in our economy and society, both from private and public enterprise, that inhibit the rights and opportunities for others to have access to economic development. And we believe that by not providing for this problem, our liberties will not be truly felt either. And we believe that maintaining the quality of life for all the individuals by solving for environmental impacts and also the impacts of exploitative labor, and by requiring a helping hand to lift those who cannot lift themselves is a priori issue before the rights of a free market. And we will soon see the distinction once we move on to the issues of minimum wage and taxation. So without further ado, and I know this speech was shorter than 10 minutes, but we welcome the Young Americans for Liberty.
As Young Americans for Liberty, we believe that protectionism actually hurts the economy as a whole. First, what exactly is protectionism? Some examples might be subsidies for domestic businesses or quotas and tariffs on imported goods. Now, how do these things affect our companies? Well, first, it can make them less competitive. Basically, if we keep these protectionist measures in for a long enough period of time, the companies might become accustomed to it, they get used to it. They're not exposed to the same market pressures that other companies that they'd be competing with are. So overall, it makes our companies less competitive, and in the end, it will not work. But doesn't protectionism save our jobs? Doesn't it keep jobs here in America? Well, this is where we get into the difference between the seen and the unforeseen effects of protectionism. For example, after the 2004 election, George Bush fulfilled a campaign promise by putting a tariff on imported steel to protect workers' jobs in the swing state of Pennsylvania. Now, you can see how protectionism can get political. Basically, you'll only protect certain industries for votes for politicians, because that's what they're there for. They're there to get votes. That's how they get elected. So you can see how the political pressure can be applied to protectionism, and it's totally unfair. Now, it is easy to see the jobs that are protected by, say, a steel tariff in Pennsylvania. Really easy to see those jobs. However, what you don't see is the overall rise in the price of steel and how it affects consumers and other businesses. For example, consumers now might not buy as much products because they're now more expensive because the steel prices increased. Also, take automakers, for example. The steel prices increased. Now you've put unfair burden on these automakers who are now paying an artificially higher price for steel. Lastly, protectionism is illogical if you take it to its conclusion. Why not protect between states, counties, and cities? Like, why do we do that? Why do we just limit it to national borders? It seems that we're striving for this ideal of self-sufficiency, like it's something that we should be achieved, but really that's not what we should be going for at all. Really, we should be trying to focus on producing what we can produce the best. And now I'm going to turn it over to Brittany, who will elaborate on why free trade why it's good.
All right, like Drew was saying, we should be producing things, get the most benefit for our costs. So maximize benefits, minimize costs. That's the goal. But before I delve into free trade, I just want to go over, our definition of it, so that there's no kind of semantic dispute. The way we define free trade is it's a voluntary, mutually beneficial interaction between two individuals. And each of those qualifiers is essential for free trade to even exist in the first place. Voluntary, because if there's coercion involved, obviously that's not free. Mutually beneficial, a trade won't occur in the first place if both parties aren't made better off by making the trade. So it has to be mutually beneficial, and it can be between individuals. And that can go from literally me and you trading something to different countries trading things with each other, because at the end of the day, any group, any country, it boils down to an individual. So voluntary, mutually beneficial transaction between individuals. And we can also see that free trade, using those principles, encourages competition. And Economics 101 will show you that competition leads to lower prices. Say I want to trade with you, or I'm competing with you, and I want to draw in customers. So I would say, oh, come over here, my prices are lower. Well, in retaliation, you would say, well, come here, my quality is better. So eventually people start trying to build a better mousetrap, and quality goes up, innovation goes up, and then there's tons of empirical, peer-reviewed research out there that shows that innovation leads to economic growth. So essentially free trade leads to economic growth, which is always a good thing. There's always going to be winners and losers in a society. Our argument is just that the market, which is made up of me and you, millions and millions of individuals, are better at picking those winners and losers than some faceless bureaucrat in Washington, D.C. So whenever we say that there's going to be winners and losers in a society, if you adopt free trade, yes, there's still going to be losers. There's still going to be people that fall through the cracks. But the thing is that it's been shown that even the losers are better off. They don't lose as much as they would have under protectionism. So at the end of the day, if we see that free trade and not adhering to any protectionist policies actually helps people, whether you're rich or poor, to continue to argue for protectionism is basically to say that you know what's best for other people. And I think that's a misguided approach to that, because you're basing it off of this should happen in my opinion. Well, your should is no better than my should. So we like to focus on what is, and what is the case is that free trade helps everyone, whether you're rich or poor. So we're just about advocating freedom across the board, because if you're going to try to control the economy in any way, whether it's minimum wage, whether it's trade, whether it's tariffs, whether it's subsidies, whether it's any of the other things that we're going to be talking about today, whenever the government tries to control the economy in any way, what they have to do is control people. And whenever you control people, that's less freedom. Less freedom always ends up bad. And that's all I have to say about free trade right now. It's also a little bit under time. I'm sure y'all want to get to your rebuttal, and then we have some points too. So, you want to? Okay.
So next we'll have the rebuttal from the Young Democrats first, then YAL second. So 2 minutes rebuttal.
I think it's 5 minutes, right?
5 minutes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, first of all, about the faceless. One term that I heard that was very interesting in my mind was the term that we often hear, whether it's spin masters in the media, libertarians, conservatives, and some liberals, is the term faceless bureaucrat. Because yes, there are a lot of bureaucratic rules and regulations and requirements that just don't make sense. We are not going to take a stance defending that. We're not going to take a stance defending senseless regulations. But one thing that I want to take a stance on today pertaining to free trade versus fair trade is faceless greed. Now, there was a company, and let me first of all introduce myself. I'm from from north central Arkansas. Many of my friends, my family were living in the B Branch, Clinton area, and if you've ever been through there, you know it's a very rural area. It's a very small area. There used to be about 4 or 5 manufacturing plants, I believe. I know there was at least 3. One of them was the Volex cord plant. The company did very well, employed over 300-400 people. My grandma, my mom, a number of other relatives worked there. My grandma worked there until 2003. She worked there, and she didn't get laid off for one reason. That was because the plant was closing down, not because they were doing poorly, but they realized that they could make a slightly higher profit in Mexico because there were far less stringent labor regulations. Like my grandma was paid, I believe, $9 an hour. Well, they found out they could work for a smaller wage. So they took the company, they took hundreds of jobs, they shipped it to Mexico. Yes, there are some faceless bureaucratic rules out there, but there's also faceless, senseless greed. And that's a fact. And I'll go ahead and turn this over to Jared. Thanks.
One of the things I found interesting with your guys' constructive was that we agreed on a lot of different things. I mean, of course, we do advocate for having regulations on trade with other nations, and I appreciate your definition of free trade. You know, it's mutual, it's beneficial, and it can be between anybody. It's voluntary. But like the legal definition of free trade is trade between countries free from government regulation. And this is a recognized thing, and it's easy to be like, you know, like we want free trade to be like a respectful mutual relationship, like, you know, of course everybody wants that, but that's not what happens whenever we do have different, when we don't have regulations on businesses and how they trade with other nations. And a lot of the things that you found problem with protectionism, with hindering the economy, we agreed with that, especially with focusing so much on high tariffs, and also focusing on so much on high tariffs, as well as saving all these different industries and not letting the private sector try to take over and make their own decisions. But with your definition not being the common definition, not being the one that's being practiced, I still find fault with the issues of exploitative labor, the issues of the environmental impacts. Those were really brought up of what happens when we don't have regulations on businesses and the way that they treat other lands. I mean, we can see empirically how with our trade with other nations, like our destroying of landscapes and all of our ecological foundations, those weren't touched. And I think those were some of the most prudent things that I brought up, and also the fact that if we destroy our environment and we literally make it to where resources are not available anymore, and our relationships between these nations are so hindered because of the way that we've left their landscape, we lose all business opportunity in the first place, and that's of course not what we want. Those weren't brought up, and I feel like those regulations need to be understood as what actually happens and not what the definition, like what we would prefer it to be. So we definitely advocate for a middle ground, that we can't have a polarizing effect on either. That makes it dubious, and we have to use empirics on both sides of how protectionism as well as free trade is good for the world.
Okay, rebuttal from Young Americans United, 5 minutes.
Okay. The first thing I want to bring up that they always said something called fair trade. Well, like we said, if all trade is mutually beneficial, all voluntary, there's really all trade is fair at that point. You know what I mean? Now, he did bring up a point about slave labor. We're not advocating for that. We're not in favor of slavery in any way. That's not right. But there's a difference between slavery and sweatshops. Now, sweatshops, you said exploitation of workers. So I've been to China. I've seen these sweatshops, and there's walls around a lot of these compounds. And it's not to keep the people in, it's to keep people out. People line up for these jobs every day. And it's because the alternative that they face if that company was not there is really like agriculture. It's like ancient agriculture, medieval agriculture. And that's what they're coming out in China. They're coming out of the countryside into the cities, industrializing this way. Second thing I want to bring up is the environment. When you have these people in such desperate situations like that, the best way to improve the environment is to make them richer. And I think China's a perfect example of this. It's come out of poverty. It brought so many people out of poverty so quickly that now people are finally rich enough in China to actually care about the environment. Before, if you just live in a horrible slum, the last thing you care about is a little bit of air pollution. It really is. You really would like a house. You would really like to eat better. You would like a lot of other things. So the best way to actually get people to actually care about the environment is to bring them out of poverty and make them richer. I'll let Brittany now talk say a few points about greed and yeah, okay.
Okay, the first thing that I wanted to bring up, though, was in regards to fair trade. Like Drew just said, any trade is fair trade as long as it's voluntary, mutually beneficial. So define fair. But another thing is that you said, with the definition of our definition of free trade that includes the word voluntary, that means without government regulation. So if, say I'm a company and I want to do X and the government comes in and says, oh, no, you can't operate your business that way, that's not voluntary. So it is still in line with how, that definition is perceived. Regarding the environment, Drew is absolutely correct whenever he says that, whenever people get richer, they care about the environment more because they can afford to. Another point to be made about the environment is that, if you do encourage private property, you focus more on taking care of your own property. You have an incentive to take care of it, whereas if there's a common ground, then you get tragedy commons that comes in, and you can see how that would be bad. Let's see. You said that we shouldn't protect every industry, and we agree with that completely. But we agree, or we think that you should not protect every industry. That's literally every industry. So if we shouldn't protect every industry and we should protect some, which industries should we protect? Who decides that? Why do they have the authority to decide that? And you also mentioned, our different views, or, we pretty much have the same views on rights. Like we don't value one set of rights over another. But you did mention that whenever, say we lose a right or some freedom in some way, you said that it doesn't affect other freedoms. Well, our argument is that, if you do lose a little bit of freedom, it does affect other freedoms. For example, right now, this is an economic issue. If you don't have economic freedom, that's a foundation for many other freedoms that you have. You don't have political freedom. You don't have freedom as a whole. So, whenever one freedom is infringed upon, the others are in jeopardy as well, because everybody knows that if you give the government an inch, they'll take a mile. And regarding greed, everybody's greedy. Everybody has profit motive. Like Milton Friedman says, it's not us that's greedy. It's always the other people that are greedy. So greed isn't a bad thing. Greed drives competition. Greed drives innovation. It's a good thing for people to be greedy and self-interested. The word greed has a stigma attached to it, but so does capitalism, so does socialism, so does all these other words. So if we lose the business opportunity, like regarding the environment that y'all were talking about earlier, if we destroy the environment and we destroy the business opportunities, there's no profit motive in that. So going back to greed, there's no profit motive, no greed. There's no incentive to just completely destroy the entire environment, for the sake of business, because eventually that'll dry up. So that's all I have to say about that.
Okay, move on to the second question. And change the board.
I think it's gonna be
So the question is, should the government redistribute wealth from the rich to the poor? YAL, 10 minutes. Young Democrats will have 10 minutes after that, and then we'll do some 5-minute rebuttals.
Right, in short, it's kind of misleading to say income is redistributed, because income isn't distributed in the first place, it's earned. So whenever we redistribute wealth, we're not really doing anything except shuffling around what people have earned. But no, we don't believe that the government should be in the business of redistributing income, from the rich to the poor. Ultimately, this leads to misallocation of resources, which results in inefficiencies in the market, and it takes away the very incentive that drives productivity in the first place. But we hear all the time, well, the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. Well, that's not necessarily the case. The wage gap, what a lot of people that are users of that argument, I guess, is that they'll focus purely on the wage gap, and it's true that the wage gap has increased. But that's not really a bad thing, because that doesn't take into account the share of total income or the real mean household income or income mobility. So while it may increase as a whole, income mobility in each household has actually risen over the past, since 1967. That's just where I began my data on here. But citing just the share of income fails to take into account whether the absolute income has increased. So say the wage gap increases, that doesn't mean that people haven't moved up and gotten rich as a whole. So just to throw out some numbers here, the share of total income, yes, it has increased. So whenever people cite data saying, oh, the wage gap is wider, that's absolutely correct. The top 20% of wage earners in 1967, it was 43.6%. 2009 was 50.3%. So that's it went up. While the bottom 20%, it actually decreased from 4.0% to 3.4%. So, rich got richer, poor got poorer. But that doesn't tell you the the mean household income for those people. So the top 20%, in 1967, the mean was $100,000 roughly a year. In 2009, that went up 71% to $170,877. So a 71% increase in absolute income. Whereas the bottom 20% in 1967, they got $8,984. And so by the standard of rich getting richer, poor getting poorer, they should be making less than $8,000 now, right? Wrong. They make $11,552 now in 2009, a 25% increase. So the rich aren't getting the rich are getting richer, but the poor aren't getting poor. The poor are actually getting richer also. And that doesn't even take into account the idea of income mobility. If you divide all the wage earners up into 20% intervals, if you started off in the bottom 20%, do people move up, into another quintile? And we see that they do by a pretty astronomical amount. From 1987 to 1996, 45% of the people that were in the bottom 20% moved up. And then in the next 10-year period, another 40% of the people moved up from the bottom quintile. From the same time period, 1987 and 96, 42% of the people that were in the top quintile actually moved down. And in the next 10-year period, another 40% moved down. So you have people moving up and people moving down. There's income mobility all over the place. And so the argument simply that the rich are getting poor, or the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poor, that's why we need government to come in and help the poor people out. The top percent or top 1%, 20%, the rich people can pay their fair share, to help them out, because they just keep getting poorer and poorer. Well, we see that they're actually not. So then what's the, role of government then? So there's not the problem that you thought existed. So, government can kind of just mind its own business regarding that. So, economics is not a zero-sum game. That is, whenever you make more money, it doesn't take away money that I could have made. A lot of people that will argue for income redistribution will say that it needs to be shuffled around to be more fair. Well, what's more fair than keeping what you earn? And if I'm not entitled to, or if I'm entitled to what you earn, how is that fair, and why? Our argument is that it's not fair. And with free enterprise, the less government regulation, the better. We end up making the pie bigger for everyone. Instead of, we have a pie right here, and if I eat, most all of it, that you only have this much pie left. That's not the case, with the economy, because it's not a zero-sum game. We just want to make more pies, fill up this entire room with pies. So with capitalism and free enterprise and free markets, that's what happens. Otherwise, you're just shuffling wealth around. You're not creating it. And if you want to grow the economy and make lives better for everyone, as we determined in the first question, you got to engage in free markets. One thing that we had talked about before is progressive tax system, and how it's basically we need people to pay their fair share. But the thing is that actually disincentivizes productivity. For example, like this is just a very minute example, it's me. Last year, I worked 3 jobs total, and at the same time, which was nerve-wracking. But I worked 3 jobs total, and I turned in 2 of my W-2s. I completely just absentmindedly forgot to turn in my 3rd W-2. So I went to go make an amendment on my taxes. Adding that 3rd W-2 bumped me into the next tax bracket to where I was no longer getting money back, which is my money in the first place. It actually made me pay in. So what's my incentive to continue working? I was wanting to work hard and make a lot of money and have 3 jobs and be super productive, but I'm not going to do that anymore if I'm going to have to pay in every year. That's asinine. So it's the same thing whenever just apply that to businesses. If there's a progressive tax system in place, then I'm not going to expand my company. I'm not going to try to make more money. I'm not going to try to hire more people because I know that I'm going to be taxed to death. So that's just bad. So if you want to have everybody pay their fair share, the progressive tax system isn't it. Having the rich pay more than the poor, middle class, or whoever else. The fairest thing, I guess, I would obviously argue for no taxes at all, but that's a completely different discussion. But the fairest tax, that's practical, is having everybody pay the same percentage, same rate, because you don't disincentivize anybody from productivity. People are able to, it's simple. Look how big our tax code has grown, like ever since 1913. It's ridiculous, and how anybody's supposed to, wade through that without, messing something up is out of control. But so we just argue that letting people freely manage their own lives and not getting government in there to say we know what's better, or we know how you should spend your money better than you do, or we know how the economy should work, or we know how everything should just fit together really neatly and hopefully it'll work out. It doesn't happen like that. So if you try to centrally plan something, I was reference Hayek here right quick, uses knowledge in society, there's no way that a government, which is simply a group of individuals, to even acquire all of the information that all of us know, all the individuals that are participating in the market, there's no way that they can even acquire that information in order to make those decisions in the first place. So you're just right off the bat, you're going to lead to inefficiencies, and it's not going to work out. People are going to be hurt because of it. And usually it's going to be the people that you're trying to help that you're going to hurt. Whether it's creating a dependence or, say you take from the middle class to give to the poor. Well, the middle class could use it just as well. Or, I'm, I guess, technically poor, lower class, I don't know, college student, and I had to pay in. How does that help? And I was trying to be productive and had 3 jobs. So just as long as people are able to freely choose what to do with their own money as they want to, you're going to see the best results out of anything, and we're going to see wealth creation instead of wealth redistribution. And if you want to talk about progress, that's real progress. So, y'all.
You got 10 minutes.
All right, thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Well, first of all, the no tax idea is another discussion, and I hope that we have it again very soon. It would take more than 10 minutes to go over that. First of all, the idea of a flat tax, we had a discussion before about flat tax versus progressive. Well, Brittany just described the idea of a flat tax. I'm sorry, the negative side effects of a progressive income tax system, which we currently have. And not saying there are not problems with it, but let me go ahead and go through a few things. TaxPolicyCenter.org is an organization, a watchdog organization that observes, that goes through our tax system and goes over the effects that new policies, old policies have on income earners. One of the things I did not hear in Britain when they discussed the progressive tax was, when you make a system, when you take all the tax rates and bring them down to whatever rate it is. I don't know what kind of rate they're going for, maybe 10, maybe 5, maybe 0. Well, 0, when you bring it to one level, to one rate, then that means that the deductions that people that are poor, lower income, middle class, people that are working, like the earned income tax credit, that's a tax deduction. It's a tax credit for working poor families that many people that I work with benefit from, and they've worked hard their whole lives. Under a flat tax, generally speaking, there are a few extreme examples, there may be some extreme differences, but the income tax credit deduction would be taken away. So if you're a working poor person that takes advantage of that, your share, the share that you pay in taxes, will go up. Your taxes will go up. If you benefit from the mortgage deduction, your tax deduction will most likely be taken away, because under a flat system, under a flat rate, you have no deductions. The idea is you close all the loopholes, you close all the deductions, period. That includes those that benefit lower and middle income folks. So that's point one. Point two, one thing I did not hear pertaining to the flat taxes, will this system raise the same level of revenue that we currently raise right now with our progressive system? Let's say this. Let's say we raise. This is obviously not the correct number, but let's say we were to raise $100 through the progressive tax code. Well, if you're going to convert from a progressive to a flat tax, how are you going to manage that? How are you going to bring up the same level of revenue, the same number, the same revenue number? How are you going to do that? Other than by raising taxes on middle income and lower income people. That's how you do it. Now, that is unjust. That's going to wipe out I'm sorry, let me back up. That's going to damage the wallets of many folks that are working. But let me also go ahead and say this with regards to revenue, because if you're going to cut taxes for millionaires and billionaires, and under a flat tax, one of the big appeals is that those that are paying the highest rates, those that are closer to the top, those people see their tax rates go down. ExxonMobil, this company that's responsible for this big oil spill over in Mayflower, they would get a tax cut. And I'm interested as to how much money, if we were to implement a flat tax, what kind of tax cut they would get, how much money they would get back. Let me also go through something else here, because I know that there's no actual libertarian, no official libertarian, well, except Ron Paul, but he's yeah. Is that another discussion too? Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky proposed back in 2012 a budget that was designed to close down the deficit and to shut down, or at least cut, many government programs. Let me go through a couple of examples of what they would cut in the process of implementing a quote-unquote fair, flatter tax code, what they consider fair and flatter. One of the things that they would cut, they would reduce, or I'm sorry, let me, they would reduce the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention by 20%. That's a healthcare service that benefits hundreds of thousands of people that have diseases. That service would be slashed. It would be slashed from 2008 levels. So just imagine how much we spent back in 2008. That was 5 years ago. The cut would be much larger. National Institute of Health, 20%. They would reduce the National Park Service by 30% from 2008 levels. So the whole idea is all these people that work in these services, these park rangers, these are not faceless bureaucrats. These are people. These are individuals. They're trying to earn a living too. The thing is, they're working in these national parks. And my opponent might say, well, we're not necessarily going to lay them off. We're just going to turn them over to the states. Well, that may be true, but there's some states that may not be in the mood to pay for it. More conservative state governments, Texas. I can't imagine a conservative governor like Rick Perry taking care of a national park very well, considering his ties to the oil industry and his support for the oil industry. We could very well kiss those environmental protection services goodbye. And finally, it all boils down to this. If you are going to cut taxes for the CEO of ExxonMobil, for Donald Trump, I'm going to pick on Donald Trump today. I'm jealous of his hairdo. If you're going to cut his taxes, give him back, I don't know, $400,000 or $500,000 as an additional tax relief. Where's that going to come out of? Whose pocket is that going to come out of? It's not just going to come out of, I know the old welfare stereotype. Is it going to come out of their pocket? No, not just those folks. Also people that are working, park rangers, school teachers, firefighters, police officers. Now, most of those funding for those particular jobs do come from the states, but there are grants from the federal government that do pay for those, that help pay for those services, but they would be cut. And I make the assumption that under implementing a strict budget system like they endorse, like Rand Paul's, you would see these services cut. Meanwhile, Donald Trump's getting his tax cut. I do not define that as progress. I do not define that as pro-growth. You're laying off hundreds of thousands of jobs. Pretty much this plan that Rand Paul outlined is the sequester 2.0. It's much worse. And I assume, Brittany, I'm not for sure if you endorse that plan. I know that you had forwarded it to me on Facebook. So I make the assumption that y'all do endorse that kind of strict budgetary strategy. So there you go. We're going to lay off potentially hundreds of thousands, over 100,000 soldiers. We cut military personnel by 10% across the board. Don't forget Camp Robinson. If you have a relative serving in that base, you better look out, because they're going to lose their services. They're going to lay some folks off, but don't worry, because that money is going to go back to Donald Trump where it belongs, according to some folks. So I'm sorry, I'm a little bit under time, so I will. Jared, do you have anything you want to say?
I just had some issues with like, what about the people who are truly limited in the world and need more money in order to be able to get close to the freedom and like economic pursuit? Because we cannot tell ourselves that even today in 2013 in America, everybody has the same exact opportunity, and we believe that we must provide that opportunity in order to even like the opportunity for economic prosperity and true liberty, the one which you guys are advocating for, is not there for lots of people in this country. And so, I mean, what about in circumstances like that? How would a flat tax, especially with the cuts that Seth was bringing up, would ultimately just damage like the opportunity that they have to even like get close to the potential of having economic freedom. And you guys talked about the incentive to be rich is slipping. It's definitely not true. I mean, like, yeah, like I understand, like, like you work 3 jobs and you're like, you get put in a higher tax bracket and you're working, you're slaving away every day, and like you feel like why do I do this whenever the money that I'm like really working hard for gets taken away. But the incentive to get rich is obviously here. I mean, if we like turn on the television, look at all the different like celebrities that we idolize. I mean, if you look at American culture, we desire to be rich more than anything. That's why, and you talk about the incentive of it goes away. Like, then we would, if the incentive of it has gone away, then capitalism would have been failed today. So I'll leave it to you guys for your rebuttals.
Okay. Yeah, 5 minutes on your rebuttal. Just 1 second.
Okay. Just a quick thing regarding the progressive tax. You said that there were some problems with it. Well, that seems to be the case with every government program that's in effect. We need to keep fixing it and keep reforming it and keep reforming it without considering whether or not it should exist in the first place because it's inherently toxic. Whenever talk about, let's see, I wrote benefit from. Oh, okay. Whenever we cut taxes or people benefit from tax cuts. The reason they're benefiting of it is because it's essentially less money of theirs that's stolen. So say you have $100 in your pocket and I steal $50 from you every single week this week or this month. And next month I only steal 25 from you. Well, you're benefiting from that, but basically I'm still the bad guy in that. So that's what is our main beef with taxes. Whenever you ask, oh, well, how are we going to raise revenue? We need to sustain these taxes and keep taxing the rich at higher rates so that we can sustain the amount of revenue increases that we're able to have right now. Well, our argument would be we don't need to do that. We need to be cutting spending. And so if you want to raise revenue, do it the other way. We don't need to be raising taxes on anyone right now, especially in this economy. And let's see. I'll get y'all this research later tonight if you want to. But even if you tax the rich, the top 1%, however much, or even the top 10, 15, 20%, 100%, all of their income, you still would not be even close to sustaining the country. As far as needing revenue or paying down the debt or anything like that. You can literally drain them of all their worth and you could still, it's just math, still not fix any of these problems. The problem is that we need to cut spending and cut taxes, which will incentivize people to go out and purchase more and create new innovations, be more productive, et cetera. Regarding the desire to be rich, yes, we're absolutely in a culture right now where celebrities and stuff are super prominent. We have billionaire TV shows and stuff like that. I can't stand to watch those. Like people like Kim Kardashian make me want to throw up. But whenever I say it takes away the incentive, like I think you got that, with my personal story. And then even with small businesses, I mean, if, like I used to work at a place called Embroid Me, and, there's no incentive to expand. And she was always having, problems with, I'm not going to do that because, I'm going to be bumped up into the next tax bracket and stuff like that. So she never hired anybody else or expanded her business at all because she, would, have much more taken from her from that. As far as Rand stuff, Rand Paul goes regarding his proposed budget, well, let's give the hypothetical that he's won the Republican nomination and the presidency. The things that he wants to cut, 20% for disease research, 20% for parks, 10% for the military, all of this needs to be cut in the first place. I would say that's even too less because, we are overreaching right now, with the government. We are spending, we cannot physically spend money on that. We are $16 trillion in debt. We're running $1 to $2 trillion deficits every single year. How are we supposed to sustain that? So yes, if we have to cut 20% off of, parks, yeah, we can afford to do that. Regarding 10% off the military, you do realize that we have the biggest military on the planet. Our military spending, is more than, what is it?
The next 13 nations.
Next 13 nations combined. It's more than, there's no 10% off the military. Yes, we can handle that. As far as government jobs being, people being laid off from government jobs, first, government jobs are less efficient than ones in the private market because, it's creating wealth and it's creating opportunities and productivity, whereas government jobs don't. I always have one more point so Drew can throw some stuff in. Regarding Donald Trump, whenever you say we should want to cut taxes, we want to cut taxes for everyone. And you say, who does it come from? Where does this belong? Where does this tax cut come? Those were his taxes in the first place. That's his money in the first place. So again, whenever you cut taxes for him, you're not giving him money out of someone else's pocket. You're letting him keep more of the money that he earned in the first place. So, Drew?
Well, first of all, it is not our position to oppose any spending cuts whatsoever. We have had here in the state of Arkansas, before we had a Republican majority. I know that y'all aren't Republican. I'm just saying, just throwing it out there. They did introduce conservative levels of spending. There were programs that were reduced, spending that was least harmful. That spending cuts that were deemed least harmful were cut. We do not favor and tax the top 1% as the only solution to the budget deficit crisis. We don't say that. We favor one that does both. Cut some spending, but we also raise revenue, whether it's through asking those the top percent to pay 2 or 3% higher income bracket. I don't think it's going to kill a billionaire if their tax bracket or if their tax rate goes up 3%. First and secondly, we have had, and I know that there are small businesses that are hurting. The example you just cited, there are businesses, folks out there that are hurting, and we should do whatever we can to help them. We should work together in ways that can help them. But let me also point out something that I don't remember if it's Drew or if it's Brittany said this, but said that we've had a progressive tax code. It was introduced first in the Lincoln administration, but it was reintroduced in 1913. We've had one since 1913. It has changed to a certain degree every few years, but it has been a progressive income tax code since 1913. But our economy has not died. It did not throw back in reverse. It did not collapse. So this idea that if we ask the wealthy to pay if we ask them to pay a higher rate, that the economy is just going to collapse, that's absolutely not true. The history doesn't show that. But let me go back to the military personnel thing. We're not talking about just 10% of the overall defense budget. We're talking 10% military personnel. These are personnel. These are civilian workers. These are soldiers. This is more specific than just the overall defense budget. Military personnel. And while there are government programs that do not work, folks, I think one could make the argument, and as a college student, I will very well make the argument, that slashing Pell Grants across the board, dropping I think Senator Rand Paul wanted to drop Pell Grants to 2008 spending levels. Back in 2008, we were spending $4,600 for the top benefit you could get. It's now $55. It's about $5,500. So you would lose close to $1,000 if you were very poor, most benefiting from this program. But let me also go ahead and make one more point. My grandpa has worked hard his whole life. He's not perfect. He's a human being just like anybody else. He worked until a few years ago when he found out about 2 years ago that he had lung cancer. And he had to go on the Medicaid program to help pay for his chemo treatments. His chemo treatments cost nearly $20,000 per treatment. I think the actual number was closer to, it was $17,000, but it was close to 20 grand. He could not have paid that on his own. And what we consider a good investment is when 250,000 Arkansans, we're one of the poorest states in the country, folks. We have $500 million coming into our state. The Arkansas Hospital Association said this would create thousands of new jobs. It would protect thousands of jobs, nursing jobs, physician jobs. Rural hospitals would be able to keep their jobs. And at the same time, 250,000 people get health insurance through private health insurance. So am I out of time? Oh, okay, well, I'll go ahead and hand it over to you.
All right, so I might have to wrap this really fast. Okay, so back to your articulation that the progressive tax is stealing. While you do not agree with the tax brackets, the majority of the people in America advocate for the progressive tax. Also, we don't live in 1770 colonial America. We have fair representation, and so effectively, it is not stealing. And if it is a problem for you, like campaign and organizing, that's what we could do. And I know that that's what you're doing, so I mean that's good. But if you advocate through like the libertarian idea of that the masses and how what they think and what they desire is the most important, that we should follow that, doesn't that contradict like the fact that literally the majority of Americans favor the progressive tax? I just thought that was an interesting idea in the whole this is stealing argument. Time's up? All right. Yeah. Okay. All right. The Young Democrats advocate for staying with the status quo and keeping the federal institution of minimum wage. And now, kind of like on a philosophical level, we believe that the rights of workers receiving a mandated set wage that helps families survive is prudent to the role of society. That if we live in a society, we have to function as a community. And even on a purely economical terms, we have to build relationships in order to conduct business. And our role as a society in America requires that we at least make sure that our neighbors can live. This, as the Young Democrats, is our core belief. Does this responsibility require us to completely abandon our lives in order to ensure that others have a good one? No. Thankfully, we do not live in an Ayn Rand novel and where dependency is extreme and freedom is absent. We live in a world where we must care for others and we can still care for ourselves. And while this may not be natural, because if it were, we wouldn't need government in the first place, but politics is a struggle for power. Whether that struggle may be for the power over resources, power over people, and most importantly, power of the self. It is all political. And government is instituted with the intent of trying to establish an ordered system of that struggle for power. And in America, our roots were ultimately in the struggle for power of the self. We are the most independent, individualized nation. And while history shows us how even with our freedoms, we have instituted systems of control over people, slavery, Jim Crow, suffrage issues, religious barriers, and other forms of oppressive control, we still strive for establishing the opportunity for individuals to achieve the American dream. That if you live in this country and if you try, you can live a worthy life. But to think that that dream used to actually be available in our history to the masses, and to think that it is still fully here would be a denial of our history and the facts. When we look at past immigration laws and voting laws, we see how we were able to keep people from achieving the American dream. And even when we look at the last century, we see how our society still kept people from achieving what ideologically made America great. Examples like how we used to draw housing markets in the 40s and the 50s and how black communities were automatically given a lower appraisal rating. This caused these black communities to become isolated and lose market value tremendously. And what happens when these communities lose value? Well, the markets become so dysfunctional that any business that was successful felt the need to move. So effectively, we had these extremely poor communities with absolutely zero business opportunities and impoverished schools because of property taxes and all the businesses moving out and because of this racial districting. And even though we had minimum wages back then, the actual racist legislation and unfair advantage that the markets took caused these neighborhoods to be further entrenched into poverty. And while we have now abolished these segregative racist laws and practices, an entire population of people were still in the shackles of poverty. Now, you may say that with the abolition of these practices, these communities have all the opportunity they need in order to rise up from their sad state. But this is simply not true. This is why the minimum wage must stay. By paying people minimum wage, we are protecting them against poverty and giving them more chance to get out of poverty. The deeper one is into poverty, the harder it is to get out. The reason why we have large populations of all sorts of people in poverty comes from many different reasons. But the fact that minimum wage is a security measure against employers who would pay an unfair non-living wage is drastically important. From the worker's standpoint, the protection of workers from the employer is prudent. Unemployment rate is never 0%. There are always people who are looking for a job or looking for changing the job. That is the reason the employer is in a better position to negotiate terms of employment. They could force people to work for a very low salary, and even if they could afford to pay them more money, they will not do it. The employer is setting up the terms and they want the highest profit possible. Therefore, they will pay them as little money as they can. We can empirically see this with the issue of undocumented citizens. In fact, where I'm originally from, which is Rogers, Arkansas, we have one of the highest population of illegal immigrants in the state. And constantly on the news or in the paper, I was hearing about different businesses hiring these undocumented citizens and paying them well under the minimum wage requirement. The reason they did this was because they knew that the undocumented citizen would not be able to alert any authority over their unfair pay. Because if they did so, they would automatically be deported. This is an empirical piece of evidence that proves that the private market will choose to pay the lowest wage possible in order to maximize profit. And while profit should be the most important aspect of running a business, the treatment of workers should never be jeopardized. Now to the common arguments against the minimum wage. We are always hearing discussion about the harms of setting artificial wages in the economy, that this causes risky inflation that leads to unemployment rates increasing. The belief is that small business cannot afford to pay standard living wages, and so they do not hire all the time. This causes the unemployment rate to increase. This sounds like a totally valid theory. It sounds like a simple causal relationship between mandated minimum wage and unemployment. But through many, many different studies from around the world, around the halls of academia, around the inner circles of the most trusted and developed economists, we find that minimum wage does not cause unemployment rates to increase. Here's a quote from Betsy Stevenson, an associate professor of public policy at the University of Michigan and also served as a chief economist of the Labor Department from 2010 to 2011. She's describing the different studies on minimum wage and unemployment. Quote, "So what's the discrepancy between the theories and what so many economists think? When economists have analyzed the data, many have found few, if any, negative effects of minimum wage on employment. This has shifted some of the thinking in the profession and pointed to flaws in a perfectly competitive model. Paying workers more often leads them to feel better about their work and reduces stress, both of which increase productivity. And when workers produce more, employers' labor costs fall. Companies such as Costco have figured this out and voluntarily pay higher wages. Other firms may not care whether they pay less and get less from their workers or pay more or get more," end quote. Let me pull up a document on my computer. Sorry, y'all. Also, the Fiscal Policy Institute released a report in 2004 about the effects it has on unemployment. Here are some of their findings. Quote, "Many studies have examined this issue, the disemployment thesis, and the weight of the evidence suggests that modest increases in the minimum wage have had very little or no effect on employment. Increases using several different methods found that the employment effects were statistically insignificant." And here's another study conducted by the Department of Labor. Quote, "False minimum wage increases have little or no adverse effects on employment as shown in independent studies from economists around the country. Additionally, a recent letter by leading economists including Lawrence Katz, Richard Freeman, Joseph Stiglitz, and Laura Tyson points that in recent years there have been important developments in the academic literature on the effect of increases in the minimum wage on employment, with the weight of evidence now showing that increases in the minimum wage have little or no negative effect on the employment of minimum wage workers, even during times of weakness in the labor market," end quote. So with the idea that the minimum wage causes unemployment out the window and the empirical evidence that employers would pay extremely unfair wages if they could, and the understanding that even in this day and age, not everyone has the opportunity to become economically successful due to our past systems of economy, we can see why we need a minimum wage. Until we have pulled from the trenches the masses that live in poverty, the United States of America should continue to have the minimum wage. And to kind of tie back with the previous debate on the flat tax, with Seth's argument talking about how all these different programs would be gutted and how poor people would be further entrenched into poverty. Like I noted earlier, with these extremely poor populations, like I referenced earlier with the different housing markets and the way those function, their capabilities to utilize this economic freedom, and isn't that like they lose that, like by not having a proper education because they were so poor, by having all these different economic disparities against them, they literally don't even have the opportunity to receive the economic freedom that is the most important thing that you guys advocate for. And so we need the minimum wage because it provides the level opportunity for them to be able to strive then for economic prosperity, which you guys think is the most important freedom. And so isn't that exactly what the young Americans for Liberty desire most? All right, I'm done.
Okay. Young Americans for Liberty believes that we should not have a minimum wage for two reasons primarily. First, it's philosophical. Basically, we do not believe that the government should come between any two voluntarily contracting parties. The second reason is empirical and statistical evidence about the minimum wage laws has clearly shown that it hurts the very people it's intended to help. And before I start my example here, it has been shown, I know you cited a lot of economists like Joseph Stiglitz and some of the others on the left, but there have been surveys done of the nation's, all the nation's economists, and 94% said that minimum wage laws are tied to employment and that they do hurt it. And if you want the source, I can get that for you later. Okay, now first I want to go over a little simple example, like a micro example of how the minimum wage law directly affects unemployment. So for instance, if we have a company and its total revenue, we're going to say TR, is equal to $100 before it hires anyone. So this is just the company by itself. And there's a job seeker, maybe a teenager or someone like that with low skills. he can maybe come in, sweep the floors of the business or whatever, just have a basic job. But basically what he contributes to that company's bottom line, we're going to say is $5. We're going to call that his marginal product. So we're going to call that equal to $5. That's what he contributes. So once this company hires this person, their total revenue is going to go up to $105. Now, let's see what happens when a minimum wage law is instituted. If we say a minimum wage law is instituted and says the minimum wage is going to be, let's say, $10 an hour, just to keep it simple. $10. Basically now, the company is going to have to pay him $5 more than what he's contributing to the company. So that sends total revenue to $95. At this point, the hire is not going to occur. Hours are going to get cut, or they're going to have to lay some people off. That's for everyone that has this marginal product, everyone that's producing at this rate. So this hurts the people with the least amount of skills. Basically, if you're maybe an inner city kid or an inner city teenager, your education's not very good, your labor might not be worth more than $5. So basically, when you institute a minimum wage, anyone that's marginal product is below whatever artificial bar you set, they're just not going to get hired. So now let's look at a macro example. So this is the whole economy and how it affects it. So we're going to have a little graph here, and it's going to have a supply of labor and a demand for labor. This is quantity of labor on this axis. And then this is the wage over here on this axis. Originally, we're going to just keep the numbers the same. We'll say there was a $5 natural wage, $5 equilibrium wage. And we're going to have a quantity of labor supplied. We're just going to say 100 to keep it easy. So this is a quantity equilibrium quantity. Now, what happens whenever we institute a $10 minimum wage? Well, we come up here and we draw the line across at $10. This is minimum wage. Now, this area right here, this is the surplus labor that's created by this. Now, he stated earlier that, we always have some people turning over. There's never like zero unemployment because it's like a natural rate of unemployment. But this does create excess supply of labor, more so than the natural rate. So now, if we look at this, since we've doubled the wage, they can hire half as many. So now you're going to have 50 people only employed. So that's this half of the surplus right here. That's where that came from. That's where all those people on unemployment came from. This half, on the other hand, comes from the fact that the wage went to $10. Now you have other people wanting to enter the labor market to work for this $10. Before, $5 wasn't worth them. That was the wage that they were going to get paid. It wasn't worth it to them. Maybe they're from a nicer school, a teenager. He was like, I'm not going to work for $5, but $10 sounds like, something I would work for. His opportunity cost changed. So that's where this comes from. So now you have 150 people looking for jobs. This whole area right here is the unemployment, and that's 100 people that are now unemployed. And that's how you calculate the labor force. You see how many people are looking for jobs and how many people get laid off and all that stuff. But now let's go to some statistics and see if the statistics support this. Okay, so does it affect the least skilled workers? Yes. According to Walter Williams, a distinguished African-American economist at George Mason University, he says it also disproportionately affects minorities. For example, between 1948 and 1955, this was the last time that African-American teen unemployment rate was below white teen unemployment rate. The numbers from 1948 exactly were 9.4% black and 10.2% white. The labor force participation rate for these two groups was also higher this time, significantly higher. This all changed in 1955 when dramatic hikes to the minimum wage first came into being. And since then, we've had subsequent hikes. And now we're at African-American teen unemployment rates of over 40% and white teen unemployment rates of over 20%, with both groups having a significant drop in labor force participation. An explanation for this difference between the two racial groups is the minimum wage law actually subsidized racist preferences. For instance, an African-American teen struggles to get a job due to whatever reason, like racism or poor public schooling. He can discount his labor in order to get hired by offering to work for less than the equivalent white laborer. This means that a racist business owner would be punished for his refusal to hire African-Americans, and it would give his non-racist competitors a cost advantage in labor. This opposed to forcing a business to pay everyone the same amount, thereby making it easier for a business to say, well, if I'm going to have to pay $10, I guess I'll just hire the white person. Because now the African-American is basically bound by this $10 rule. He cannot say, oh, I want to work for less. You can't do that. You just don't have that option. Another thing about minimum wage laws is they've also been used as weapons by unions in order to protect their members from low-wage competition. One example is in South Africa. After the fall of apartheid opened up much of the labor market to black South Africans, which was once off limits, white South African unions were some of the first proponents of minimum wage laws to protect themselves from cheap labor by increasing the cost of hiring black workers. So you see, these people in South Africa, we know apartheid was a racist regime. We know they don't care about black people. So why all of a sudden, after the fall of apartheid, are white unions coming out, in support of a minimum wage law? Because they know it will cause unemployment, and they know it will protect them from this cheaper black competition. So if they can just raise that rate and not let blacks offer their labor for cheaper than that rate, they win. This tactic has also been used in the United States by unions in the North campaigning for minimum wage hikes in the South. Why would these unions in the North use their union dues to come down here in the South and campaign for higher state minimum wage rates in the South? Why would they do that? That's not what union dues are supposed to be used for. You're supposed to use it for the union. It's because they're worried about the factory's jobs coming south. That's what they're worried about. They're worried about those jobs coming down here and them getting laid off. The last thing I want to say is having a minimum wage raises the cost of labor, thereby eliminating some of these most basic jobs that could be available, like sweeping the gas station floor, or having a gas station attendant, or even movie ushers. All these jobs are gone now in America, and we always wonder why. Well, it's because we've artificially raised the price of labor so high that no one can afford to provide these jobs anymore. One last thing I want to say about this, and then Brittany, if you have anything to add. Basically, if the minimum wage law is so good, like why don't we raise it to $100 an hour? I mean, that would be great, right? I mean, but the thing about good laws is you don't need exceptions for them. Like there is no exception for the law to murder somebody. There's no exception to that. You just can't murder somebody. That's wrong. But like with minimum wage laws, we always have exceptions. Say for handicapped people or something like that. We always say, their marginal product's so low. Handicapped people, Walmart door greet or something. Well, Walmart gets special permission to pay those people lower than the minimum wage because even the government recognizes their marginal product isn't as high as other people's would be. And that's not their fault. So I just wanted to say that. So you see, there's always exceptions to these rules. And same with some states do a teenage minimum wage rate. And they say, oh, well, since teens, marginal product is so low, you can pay them below the rate, and that'll be okay. But everyone else, you got to pay them the normal minimum wage rate. So that's pretty much. So basically, overall, it hurts the people you're really trying to help. It hurts the least skilled. It hurts the poorest of the poor. Anything you want to add?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, neither group here hates poor people. We want to see poor people worse off. We all want to see everybody better off. We just have different ideas on how to achieve that. But there is tons of empirical evidence that shows that minimum wage increases unemployment and actually hurts the people that you're trying to help, which is just unintentional consequences. You're not out there trying to increase unemployment by advocating for a higher minimum wage, but that's what ends up happening. A lot of the research I'll say that is in favor of raising a minimum wage, saying that has no effect on employment, no effect on prices, no effect on anything. What they end up doing is an example like in New York, they instituted a minimum wage increase, and then 6 months later they do an economic report on it. It's like, oh yeah, no effect. No, yeah, you can't really judge that in 6 months and then pass it off as no effect. You're gonna have to take a little bit more time than that. Yeah, I forgot who mentioned it. Okay, never mind. I'll talk about it. Rebuttal. Yeah. Okay. Is it?
We have some rebuttals. Yeah. 5 minutes. Democrats.
Here you go.
Get the time set. 5 minutes when you're ready.
Okay, so I guess my first comment is going to be on both sides of us claiming that we have empirical evidence, all sides from different economists. Drew claimed that mine was from the left, and in the Betsy Stevenson quote, she talks about how, and in the article I could prove it up, I'll pull it up later at the end of this debate, talks about how only 1 in 10 economists actually felt that it had anything on unemployment rate, and they got people from the far right and the far left and the people in the middle. They had both sides of it. So not all these economists are on the left. as well as, we're both claiming that we have empirical evidence that minimum wage does not create unemployment rates. And I have some graphs up here that effectively show how real minimum wage rates versus unemployment rates from January 1950 to January 2013 don't have any like causal relationship at all. I can show you guys these. I mean, it's on my computer, so I mean, it's like, I'll show you after the debate. So I mean, like both sides are claiming we have empirical evidence. My statistics were from the Department of Labor, the Fiscal Policy Institute, the Economic Policy Institute. Betsy Stevenson, who was the chief economist of the Labor Department and a public policy professor at University of Michigan. And then on to the rate, like it affects minorities. The Economic Policy Institute has a study that shows that like what all effects will happen from a minimum wage increase, and that's not what we're advocating for, but a minimum wage increase coincides with just like the standard actually just having one in the first place, and it talks about how women are the largest group of beneficiaries from a minimum wage increase. 63% of workers who will benefit from an increase are women, and a disproportionate share of minorities benefit from minimum wage. African Americans represent 11% of the total workforce, but are 18% of workers affected by an increase. And it talks about 14% of total workforce is Hispanic, but Hispanics are 19% of workers affected by the increase. And you also talk about the inflation and like, okay, the minimum wage increase will help. And again, we're not advocating for the increase. We're advocating for having a minimum wage. But this, this shows that like these harms that you guys claim are not here. Like the inflation adjusted value of minimum wage is 17% lower in 2009 than it was in 1968, and so like what it is now was actually lower, and so we haven't seen these massive inflations. And the argument about if minimum wage is so good that we should put it up to $100 is wrong, because it doesn't match the rates in our economy, and our standard minimum wage, since we prove that they don't cause unemployment rates, since they don't cause unemployment rates and actually benefit minorities and specific groups and working class families, and improving the production of labor by having one of my last pieces of evidence where I talk about how different companies that pay their employees higher than the minimum wage, or states that have higher minimum wage than the federal minimum wage, have happier clients. The cost of labor go down. The overall production is higher, and so that's another reason why like the $100 argument is kind of like a fallacy on that part, because like we don't cause unemployment, we benefit on all sides. We increase labor, we decrease labor costs, which is what businesses are always looking for. And on to your argument that minimum wage creates racist competition, and with my evidence from the Economic Policy Institute discussing about how it affects low-income workers and also minorities, is the ultimate thing that we need. And also my references to different like redlining districts that we did in the 40s and the 50s after the World War II are exact examples of how like these different laws that keep people in poverty, and then once they're removed, they're still so poor that we need this minimum wage. And with the evidence that I brought up about how minimum wage helps out these minorities, it moves them from the extreme poverty that we're still seeing the effects from these institutions that were popular in the day. So.
Okay.
Start. Hang on a second.
All right, take your time.
You ready?
Yeah, I think so. Okay, first I'd like to say, you said it helps them out of poverty. We've had a minimum wage since 1938, and poverty, I think that first I want to talk about the definition of poverty. I think poverty's changed, since our grandparents' lifetime. Back at the turn of the century, poverty meant basically not eating. And now we say people in poverty today in the United States are overweight and they need to have better food, So, I mean, it's really a moving topic. Yeah, it's very... That's right, and iPhones and stuff like that today. So, I mean, they might not have health care, but, that's poverty today. It's not having health care versus not eating, 100 years ago. So I would say that, that's a very subjective word when we say poverty and helping them out. But again, like I would also like to say, it hasn't helped them out, because like I said, minorities are some of the biggest groups in poverty still today. I don't think it's achieved anything. It hasn't worked. We've raised it several times. The first major raise, like I said, was in 1955. Second point, going back to when y'all's main presentation was going on, why are immigrants here then, if they're getting paid less than that minimum wage? You said it's a problem. Well, the reason is because, they're coming here because that wage is higher than what they would make in their home country, They're not coming here to get paid minimum wage. They're coming here to work for less, and that's why they're here. And they're gladly take it because that's what they're doing. They're wanting to sell their labor less than that minimum wage. If you raise that minimum wage, then they can't sell that labor. No one's going to hire them. The construction companies aren't going to want to hire as many, at least. So that's what I wanted to say about that. Also, you highlighted a few firms like Costco, and that you said, it's beneficial for them to pay their employees more because they get more productivity out of them. And then you said, if other firms don't care about getting more, well, I think all businesses care about getting more, right? They're all greedy. I mean, why would one business be like, oh, well, we can make so much more money, if we just paid our employees a little bit more? Well, why don't you do it? You know what I mean? And you're coming in kind of like as a politician saying like, well, we know this business better than you do, and if you just pay your employees more, you'll make more money. I mean, come on, who knows that better? You or being the politician, being the government, coming in and telling them how to run their business. I think they know what's going to make them the most money. And I think because everyone is motivated by greed, that they will make that decision to raise their wage if they think they can get more money out of it. So let me think if there's anything else I wanted to say. Yeah, you raised both having empirical evidence and not being the girl you were highlighting. I think you said she was from the Public Policy Institute. Being in public policy, it's kind of being on that's I guess more of on the left. That's more of a big government, or it's like at least a government side perspective of it. So I mean, but I'll definitely show you those statistics about the 94%, and we can look at yours and we can compare that afterwards. Yeah. So Brittany, you want to say anything?
But like Drew was saying earlier, increased wages is a form of competition, like we were talking about earlier. Say, I want to compete with you. I want Drew to come work for me, and you're like, hey, I'll pay you $5 an hour if you come work for me. And I'll say, no, I really want Drew. He can add $10 of marginal product to my company, so I'll pay you $10 an hour to come work for me. So wages go up. So this idea that if there's no minimum wage, then all of a sudden these employers would just be like, oh, I guess he gets to work for 25 cents a day now. That's not going to happen. But let's talk about what a wage is first. The wage is a price of labor. That's how much your labor is worth to a company. So if your labor is worth $5 an hour, why should they be forced to pay you even more? Sure, they can voluntarily choose to pay you more than the marginal product that you can add to their company, but they'll be taking a cost for that. They're not, getting the most bang for their buck, maximizing benefits while decreasing costs. But at the same time, they're not going to, say, that you get paid 25 cents because you're worth more than that. And if I pay Drew 25 cents to work for me, and then you say, oh, well, that's, just bad. I'll pay you $10 to come work for me. Then he's going to leave. So I'm going to be like, no. I'll raise your rates. I'll match that. So whenever you have competition with wages, the wages go up. It's actually helpful. And also incentivizes people to be more productive. So if, say my marginal product is $5 an hour, and I know that the government is going to raise minimum wage to $7.50 or $10 an hour or whatever else, I have no incentive to increase my productivity. If I know I'm going to get paid more than I'm technically worth, then I would if I knew that, I would develop more skills to get paid more. That would incentivize me to get paid more. That's why we're all in college right now, which that's a whole nother discussion right there. But, we want to be more productive to get higher wages. So a minimum wage, is artificially, dictating that and leads to inefficiencies in the government or in the market. And, it's just bad deal all around. But like Drew was saying, we'll exchange sources and we can have a conversation on that.
Yeah, I just want to say one thing about everything we discussed today. We should never judge the policies when we're discussing them. We should never judge them by their intentions. Okay, we should always judge policies by their results. So even though it may sound good to pay people more, we're helping them out, we shouldn't just judge it based on that. We should always look at the evidence and see what the result is.
But each of the three topics that we talked about today, minimum wage, trade, income redistribution. It all, like our stance on it at least, will boil down fundamentally to the simple and moral principles of capitalism. Capitalism has a stigma attached to it. You greedy capitalist pig. It's a bad deal, but that's not what it is. All it is freedom. It's everything that we've talked about today, our side at least. But whenever everyone is free to manage their own lives without coercion from an inefficient government, or anyone else for that matter, whether it's another individual or a group itself, everyone is made better off. It's rich and poor alike. Rich get richer, poor get richer. Everything's good. So one thing to really take home is that a government can't, manage an economy without managing people. It can't control an economy without controlling people. And whether that's any of the ways that, or any of the places that we've talked about today, or topics that we've talked about today. And then without economic freedom, kind of like I mentioned earlier, you undermine every other type of freedom. But if, while we're wrapping it up here, if this sounds like something that anybody is interested in, YouTube, you can find us on Facebook, Young Americans for Liberty at UCA, UCAYAL.com, or you can email UCAYAL@gmail.com. We'd love to have you, because, if you are a freedom lover, then, who doesn't like freedom? You can join our group. There you go. Yeah, you hate freedom.
2-minute conclusion from the Democrats.
I'm just kidding.
I don't mind freedom, Jared. First of all, I would like to thank everybody for coming here, for being a part of this event. Regardless what organization you're from, I am not going to judge anybody's intentions in this room or those folks that may share the opposite philosophy. So I want to make that very clear. One thing I want to make sure is that freedom is a word that everybody has used. I'm sure that even the fascists and the communists used the word freedom when they took over their respective governments. But there's one particular freedom that I want to talk about that you often don't hear, that you haven't heard since 1944, and that's the freedom from want. There are those, regardless of how well of our economy goes, that like health insurance. There are those that are middle income, lower income students that want to go, or people that want to go to college to better themselves. We've got to make sure there are services readily available to make sure those folks can better themselves. I can't pay $6,000 out of my own pocket each semester to pay for my education. I'm not in that kind of position. I know there's many folks out there that are the same exact way. But ultimately, it is about freedom, yes, but also freedom from want. And in the end, I believe, well, there is one thing I want to say right quick about, okay, we got 30 seconds. I'll just go ahead and let Jared, because Jared was wanting to say something.
Okay. I mean, you can continue.
Okay. One thing I want to say right quick about the environment. You made the implication that poor people don't care about the environment, or that people that are lower income are not likely to take care of it. Well, ExxonMobil's doing pretty well, and they obviously didn't care. But I respect your opinions, and I respect your intentions.
Yeah, I know I only have probably 15 seconds now, but I just want to say thank you to the Young Americans for Liberty. I'm really, 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 really happy about. All right, time's up. But yeah, I'm really happy about how throughout the entire production of this we've remained civil, and yeah, and I appreciate all the audience for coming. And you got like Brittany said, you can find us on Facebook, on Twitter. Just come up to us if you see us and stuff like that. And so thank you all for coming.